Hello and welcome to another edition of Boss It. And today we're going to be talking to Pete Sena, the digital surgeon, which is quite an unusual name. It sounds painful. Pete.
So it can be painful, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, we were discussing, and we've had a previous conversation about what you do, and you cover many different areas: creative strategist, brand strategist, investor, startup expert, enabling people, giving people assistance regarding scaling up. What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Helping people achieve possibilities that they didn't know were possible, and helping people live more creative, curious lives, I'd say, is what gets me out of bed in the morning. I love what I do. I feel very blessed and privileged to do what I do.
Okay, within that context, what's been the most enjoyable experience you've had?
In a professional setting or in a personal setting? Because
we keep it professional on this live call.
Because I was going to say, certainly the birth of my son was definitely the most prolific experience of my life.
Yeah,
no question. But I'd say professionally, I've gotten to work with some incredibly smart people that have worked on prolific things. So, I've worked with some of the world's leading entertainers that are like musicians or pop stars, or so years ago I worked with Lady Gaga, and that was like just an incredible experience. High energy, high paced, high scale. I've worked with some San Francisco tech companies that have just like gone on to go public and change the world. And I think the third sort of example I would give is like helping a small business owner that is a second or third generation in their family, taking a business that might be struggling and then figure out a way to like give it new life. And I think what all three of those all have in common, you mentioned at the beginning of the sort of conversation, you said, you do a lot of things. And really for 20 years, I've been helping people tell their story. And I believe that your story is your strategy, and how you express it makes a huge difference, right? Like we could talk about anybody's story, whether they're the small mom and pop business down the street or whether they're Lady Gaga. And if we tell the right story to the right audience in the right way, it's going to move people, and it's going to move people to action, right? And it's going to move people to activate their heart. It's going to move people to activate their minds. It's going to move people to activate their wallets. And I think that that's ultimately what I do, and what the teams that I build and lead and empower ultimately focus on is like, how do we do that at scale? And that is ultimately what I do. So I would say it's all the different buzzwords, all the different industries. What they all have in common is there's a story in there. And when it gets told, and it gets told right with the right experience. And when I say experience, what I mean is like, it could be an app, it could be a website, it could be when you first walk into the hotel, the thing that you get to experience. So when I say experience, it's a little bit squishy as a term, because it could be a number of different things. It could be just the box that you get in the mail when you order something, and you open it up and it says, "Hey, Mark, thanks so much for ordering from, Outsmart Industries. We love having the best minds in science that are creating breakthrough technologies." And like, you just get this one little cool thing in the box versus like the normal brown Amazon box that you open up and you tear open the package. And there's just that moment where like, that you've had a relationship with Outsmart. I'm just using because the logo's in the background, right? You have that moment with you, and it sounds stupid, but then when you measure the before and after effect of that could create a net promoter score, NPS increase of 2 or 3, which then can make the difference between you acquiring 1,000 more customers at a fourth of the cost. So now all of a sudden you have the business completely scale. And people say, "Well, Pete, you just changed something in the box." And I say, it's no different than when you have like a plumber come to your house and your sink is leaking, and then they just hit the pipe and all of a sudden everything's fixed. And it's like, well, I could have hit the pipe. It's like, no, you couldn't. If you knew where to hit the pipe, you would have hit the pipe. So I think ultimately that's what I do is I help people figure out their plumbing issues, but instead of touching pipes, I touch creative strategy, or I touch marketing strategy. And that's what I do, and what my teams do. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it certainly it sort of brings up a number of points around creative strategy. And, you know, I've had many conversations. I'm a great believer in narrative and the story, obviously, and that's part of what I do when I work with companies. But one of the things that I'm no longer surprised about is experienced executives that we can talk at one level about that, the importance of strategy and the importance of a narrative and a story. But in truth, they don't get it and they don't act upon it. Why is that?
Yeah. I think it's a couple things. So first, let's separate gifted and talented executives from people who have just become executives, right? I want to just sort of quickly separate that if we could. So let's start with the people I like to spend the most time with, which is the gifted executives. I think gifted executives are really good at playing in abstraction. And when you play in the abstract, it's very high level. It's very big picture. And I think a lot of great strategies often like start there and sometimes even stay there. But in the absence of the details, in some cases, the strategy is not able to come. You know, I always say ideas are nothing without execution, right? In many ways. And you can have great execution with a mediocre strategy and be successful. And you can have great strategy with terrible execution and be very unsuccessful. So ultimately it's a bit of a mixed bag. So I think the gifted executives understand what the vision is, what the big picture is, and they understand how to get the right people on the bus, right? The famous executive coach, Danny.
Do you think that's because the gifted executives they're also willing to work with their instinct?
I think so. Yes, and is what I would say. I think gifted executives have incredible EQ and they understand emotional intelligence. So meaning that they understand the big picture and they understand how to build trust and vulnerability with the leaders that they lead. And as a result of it, they bring those experts together. So they know, you know what, I might not be the best person that knows about fuel cell technology or knows about these aluminum alloys, but I'm going to bring the best scientists together. But what I do know how to do is connect these particular, you know, use cases or tell these particular human stories because, you know, it's really a relationship business at that. Just a real example that just recently crossed my desk. But I think the gifted executives understand how to bring people together, get the right people on the bus, have a big vision and a big goal, and then bring that goal to life. That's what the gifted executives, in my opinion, do. And a lot of times they're very brilliant. And most importantly, they're charismatic. They're able to lead people, inspire people. They're not micromanagers. And they're sort of like, you know, what Jim Collins would call like a level 5 leader. If you've ever read the book Good to Great, which is one of my favorites. Yep. But then you have the other executives and they subscribe to something that I would call the Peter principle, which is a sort of popular term from like, I think the 80s. And it basically says that you will rise to
your level of incompetence.
The level of incompetence or ignorance of your last role. So what I think happens a lot of times is you have really good performers that are individual contributors in a company, and then they get promoted into management. And management's a very different track because now you're managing people and process more than you're managing the actual activities. So we'll just use software as an example, which I've dealt with a lot of software people. You're a really good coder and you're great at writing code. And then they promote you. And now you're a manager. So now you're in charge of other coders because they think, hey, magically, Mark's a great coder. He's going to create 10 other great coders. What they quickly realize is that management's an entirely different track. But in a lot of companies, the incentive structures are a little bit fucked up, right? So the only way to make more money is to go into the management track versus smart companies, the Googles, the Amazons, the Apples, they know some people are just really good principal engineers and we should keep paying them more and more and more and more, keep them happy and keep them growing. But if they belong being an individual contributor, keep them individual contributor.
So in the example that you gave, they could end up losing a good coder and gaining a bad manager. And then what can happen after that is they realize that they're a bad manager and they say, what do we do with this guy? Let's give him another promotion.
Well, even
get him
worse,
out of that management position.
So even worse, and I see this in big companies a lot, especially today, big companies want to retain people a lot longer because the lifespan of a person in a, you know, back in the day, lifespan of a person in a Fortune 500 company was their whole career. Now you see people bouncing from job to job. There's all these great resignation, all this kind of stuff in the world, right? But the point I drive at is there's institutional knowledge in someone's head, right? And as they rise and rise and rise in the organization and the bigger the company, you have a lot of information asymmetry. So let's just get back to Peter principle for a second. So now you have this manager, and then this manager becomes a VP, and this VP becomes an SVP. And really it's because they've been at the company a long time. They're achieving the goals, maybe moderately, in a way. Maybe they're not stellar, but they're just, what happens over time is you just slowly float to the top, right? And in some cases, dead bodies float to the top, right?
Yes.
So I think in that case, what ends up happening is you end up with mediocre executives. So going back to the first part of this conversation, I think that the big difference between what I see in a visionary executive is a visionary executive has a vision and they just need to figure out how to make it happen, versus a mediocre executive in some cases is really sort of just like trying to like manage and rearrange the deck chairs in the Titanic. So I think what ends up happening a lot of times is it's not that they are just having one gear, which is the high level gear, as you said. I think what ends up happening a lot of times is that they don't have the ingredients that they need to succeed. And you can't know what those ingredients are unless you know what the recipe is, whether you're improving the recipe or whether you're reading, verbatim them off of an existing, playbook. So I think that that's the problem is like, if you don't know where you're going, you don't have that big why. How do you move down to the what? And then how do you go from the what to the how? And then once you figure that, like you fail. So I think what ends up happening is in some cases, I think people will get jobs at really important companies that are very big companies. They overstate their value. And when they go from place to place, because, it's like no one ever got fired for hiring IBM. Well, in most cases, like if someone's worked at Apple or Google or Amazon, and that's what's on their resume, once you work at a FAANG company, it's really easy to go work at other FAANG companies. And I have friends that work at FAANG companies, and not everybody is the top of the top, as they say. So
no. And when you go into an organization and you're working with perhaps a management team or a board, how do you spot those with vision and understanding regarding strategy and those that are just purely focused on tactical?
The first thing I like to do is get to know the person and their motivations, and it sounds really basic, but I think it makes a big difference is if you know people's story, where they come from, what's important to them. I like to ask a lot of why-based questions and just to help to understand like what their priorities are and like why that's a priority for them. And, what you'll very quickly realize is the people who understand, the heart and soul of a company, right? Whether it's people or process or whether it's shareholder value or, category dominance or market share or whatever it is. So very quickly you can realize just in a short conversation without having to do anything overly elaborate, who kind of knows what they're doing and who doesn't. You can see sort of who's frustrated or not frustrated, like what ultimately is top of mind for them. What are their priorities? And then I just generally try to figure out like, what are the top 1 to 3 priorities that people have? And then what are the ones that are going really well? And what are the ones that are not going well? And I sort of just will map that out. I have a very, simple process I do. Generally, it's sort of me sketching in my notebook of what the mental model looks like for their organization. And then I try to find the things that are going good. I think a lot of companies always try to do new stuff. What I always say is like, look at what's working well and figure out how you can double down on that. And then once you've eked out and got as much as you can get from that one area, then look to the innovation. So back in the day, a really common portfolio technique people use is what they call 70-20-10, right? Which is 70% of your time, energy, and resources go to the kind of bread and butter things that everyone knows works, et cetera. 20% is sort of like you're experimenting with different things. Maybe it's channels, tactics, personnel, whatever the experimentation is. And then 10% is the thing that you want to make these moonshot bets on, whether it's like a new innovation or a new product or a new service or whatever it is, but you balance your portfolio that way. And I think that that's sort of an old tried and true technique that I think is just a simple way to kind of figure out where the energy is going. But I think more specifically, what I find is that when you get to understanding what drives people, what their motivations are, what are the things that they're thinking about and focusing their energy on, it becomes a lot easier then to work with those people and to understand what the blockers might be. And I think if nothing else, what I'm providing is perspective, right? And it's not because I'm smarter than them or have unique skills than them. My ego would like to think that, but the truth of the matter is it's just, I'm fresh eyes, right? When you're at a company for 20 years or 10 years or 2 years, and you're only looking at one thing, I'm out there, yesterday I was in Texas which is the Silicon Valley of the ed tech space, right? I was working with an ed tech company yesterday. The week before I was working with an aerospace company, right? So they're completely different, but a lot of the problems are similar in terms of like, how do we get the right talent and what's our creative strategy to be able to attract new customers? I'm able to sort of like, because I have that parity and that perspective that is not myopically focused on one thing, I'm able to sort of pick and choose from that. So I think what's different is a lot of executives become bakers. And when you're a baker, it's about a very specific formula you have to use scientifically to get that thing to be perfect, right? I like to think of myself more like a chef, where I'm improving with the ingredients that I have, with the people that I have, or the processes that I have. And I can get to new, unique breakthroughs because I'm not always following a specific recipe. I'm sort of improving off the things. So what I like to say is like, I've used the metaphor of a chef before. I've used the metaphor of like a jazz musician. Is like, there's the scientific way to grow, and then there's the creative way to grow. I like to use both. Obviously, I'm very data driven, but I think that that's an approach that not a lot of organizations that I work with have embedded in the DNA. And I think what I try to do when I get out of bed every day is try to inject a little bit more of that, or extract a little bit more of that from the companies that I work with and the leaders that I work with.
Being data driven is probably something I don't necessarily agree with you on, and something perhaps we can come back to. But something that you touched upon that I think is very relevant. You mentioned about ego. I see that as being probably one of the biggest hindrances in a lot of large organizations.
100%.
Executives, the ego gets in the way. How have you experienced that, and how do you get over that? It's a difficult one. It's an obstacle that really is corrosive. Yeah. I've actually I had to devise, specifically doing workshops and working with the senior management, and where we were doing brainstorming sessions, I had to devise a methodology that overcome ego by disconnecting ideas with individuals. Because quite often I was going into a room where there were tensions between some of those members that I'd be unaware of until we're into the workshop, where no matter what that guy puts forward, this one's he's going to go against it.
Yep.
And if he puts forward his own idea, he's going to spend the rest of the time just focused on that one idea as though it is a part of him. And I have to try and find a way to disconnect, which I did. I managed to find a way of doing that. But how much have you experienced that? And when you do, how much of an impact does it have, and how do you overcome it?
Yeah. So, well, there's a couple of things. Yes, I experience it every single day in companies. If I really make this binary, which the world is not binary, but if I make it binary, people are driven by fear and people are driven by greed. Now, I believe that people are driven by love, but I think if you make this more about just very binary, which is not, it's fear or greed. Okay, what's driving this ego? Are they afraid to be revealed? Are they afraid to lose their job? A lot of times people will look at the person, the woman or the man that's the executive. They won't look what's behind that person. They won't look at the sick family member that the person's taking care of. They won't look at, they really need this job. So what ends up happening is when we as a species, human beings, are met with pressure, whatever that pressure might be, hitting the next, the quarterly stock number, or getting promoted so they can get that bonus so that you can afford to pay off that debt that you've got, or whatever it is. No one often thinks about that. So what they see is someone's being an asshole, someone's being rude. Someone's like trying to guard for politics. So I like to sort of get behind that a little bit, because then when I understand what's driving the person, whether it's like, do they want to change the world, or do they want to just make a bunch of money, or sometimes it's both, right? Like, what are the things that drive it? So what I will do is I'll try to spend some time with the person one-on-one, but the truth of the matter is not everybody wants to be helped, right? Like, I get brought in sometimes by a C-suite, and I'll go have to interact with VPs or SVPs, and they don't want to talk to me, right? Because their boss basically brought me in, right? So now it's like, I have to build trust. I have to establish like I'm here to help, and that I'm not here to like, I'm not the axe man that's here to like try to like, fire people or get rid of people. That's McKinsey's job. I'm not McKinsey. If McKinsey calls, like, they're most likely going to be here to get rid of you, right? But jokes aside, I think what I tend to do is break it down to answer your question in a group setting. What I do is a lot of different design thinking techniques. So a lot of times I'll do like silent ideation where, I call it dissolving the hippo, and what I mean by hippo is the highest paid person's opinion in the meeting. So a lot of times I see group dynamics where when the leader's in the room, their subordinates will kind of cowl to that person because they don't want to share, they don't want to like get one up someone. And there's a lot of like ego dynamics. So what I'll do is I'll do silent ideation where we'll take post-it notes or have people kind of submit thing on a tablet or something. And then we'll have somebody on our team, one of our facilitators will kind of read the ideas out, but not attach the ideas to people. And then we'll do like, we use things called like dot voting, where we'll like vote towards like where the consensus is. We do different techniques. Like one of the techniques we do is called 6 thinking hats, where basically we actually have a person play a different role. So typically like we'll have like someone from finance that normally would be, talking about why this won't work. And now we put them in a role of like the innovator, idea person role. So now we're able to sort of build empathy and build trust with the team by flattening the room out. And I think that when you can get rid of those kind of power dynamics, which are difficult to do, when you can flatten the room out, I think you can hear a lot more from everybody. So we use techniques like that. I try to bring data into the equation as much as possible. So it's like, okay, like what's our data driven way that we can do this? So a good example is just recently, we were working on a strategy for a energy tech company that's doing a lot with machine learning. And basically, without revealing anything confidential, what I would say is they are using AI to like true AI, not like ChatGPT AI. They're using like machine learning models to basically reduce energy usage in buildings, right? Is one of the things that they do. And they're, global company. And one of the things that we did with them was started to break down what their strategy was. And what we really quickly realized is that there was not a agreed upon way that they were deciding on things. So we basically came up with a decision framework with them to say, okay, what are the different things that contribute to this decision we're going to make? And then from there, we created a criteria. And then that criteria then was weighted. So everybody could weigh in on these different ideas against these different kind of vectors, if you will. And then we just were able to summarize those ideas. And we use something called an ICE score, which, again, is just a simple thing we use in product management to be able to kind of manage cost and estimates and confidence and those kinds of things. But at a high level, like by introducing that framework, now everyone had a voice, everyone could vote. So the people who were just being cautious about something were able to have their voice heard. Then people who were like the idea people and just, big blue sky thinkers, they were able to be heard. But at the end of the day, we had a criteria that everyone agreed on, and that everyone signed off on. So now we were able to kind of flatten the room out, get input from everybody. What that led to was we were able to make a math-based decision, a data-based decision on where we were going to go. And ultimately, the emotion, we were able to diffuse the emotion. It wasn't about Mark's idea or Pete's idea or Jason's idea. It was really about, okay, we as an organization are focused on these 3 priorities, and this is how this decision is going to affect these 3 priorities. What are the different ways that we can go through the ways we can solve this problem with the resources we have right now that we can dedicate to it? And that was about a 4-hour exercise, with some breaks in between. And it led to consensus. And at the end of the meeting, you could even see in the body language, people were coming in like really like tight and like uncomfortable. People walked away like inspired. There's like a lot of water cooler chat happening. And I think that's a great example of like when you put creativity at the center of the challenge, when you focus on the problem and not the people can start to disconnect it. And I work with a lot of people who are knowledge workers, right? Coders, designers, and engineers. There's a lot of love. You leave a little bit of yourself as a maker, as a craftsman. You leave a bit of yourself in that kind of work. So it's very hard sometimes to divorce the idea from the maker and understand that it's like, this is the work, but you are not your work. Like, okay, this coffee wasn't the greatest coffee. Like, I'm not going to like get rid of that barista because they made one bad coffee. I've been going to the same coffee shop every single day for 2 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was a bad ingredient. Maybe it was a bad morning. Like, okay, like let's give that person the benefit of the doubt, but like, let's make it about the coffee, not about the barista. And that I think is
Yes.
just a technique that I learned from a leadership coach, probably, I don't know, 10, 11 years ago, that when you separate the person from the product, you can get a hell of a lot more done. And I think we see that in these things. So that's my technique for
Yeah.
ego. I hope that answers
That,
the question. I
yes, it
didn't
does.
mean
It makes a lot of sense, because I think in the respect of somebody putting forward their idea, if they attach it as too closly to their own identity, when people are looking in a very objective way at that idea, and they're having to kick the idea a bit, and you should be testing that idea. They're not kicking the person; it's the idea. And I
yeah.
think that really needs that separation. Let me ask you a question. So
Yeah.
you say that you're a creative strategist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, are you more an author or a facilitator? And you can't say both. I want you to go one side or the other. Because the easy answer is to say, well, I'll do a bit of both. Most people I interview will say that.
So
But I'm
it's a
going to
great
challenge you a
question.
little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I would say I'm predominantly an author. Is 100% who I am and what I do. Over the years in working with executive teams, what I've realized is I've had to play the role of a facilitator. But the learning that moment that happened for me is I spent a couple of years where I was on the road a lot and pre-COVID, and I was facilitating a lot of these big workshops.
Yeah.
And a big part of being a facilitator is like, holding space and getting the best stuff out of everybody. I realized I was very unfulfilled in just doing the facilitation, because I am an author by trade. I have a lot of unique original thoughts, and that's really where my magic comes in, is like being a provocateur of thought and like pushing and bending thoughts and that sort of thing. So what I realized is, again, back to self-awareness, right? Is I realized that I'm not the best person to be the facilitator. So what I would do is then I started bringing in great facilitators. And then what I could do is the thing that the clients were hiring me to do, ultimately solve the problem. How I solved the problem was by being in the chairs with them, helping to solve the problem, not just being the facilitator. So I would say, that answer your question, I'm definitely much more of an author. I've had to play both roles in my career, but I think where that's led me is that I think people now call me to help them solve problems versus to help mediate and facilitate problems. So I've got a great team of facilitators on my team that I'll bring. I was just in Texas with one where we led a workshop, and he was facilitating, and I was able to really participate as an ideator and as a shaper. It was me, the CEO, one of the key investors, and then sort of two of their kind of top marketing folks on the team. So I was able to be in the chairs with them, and my facilitator was able to sort of facilitate. He's also great at authorship, but I think where he gets a lot of joy is in holding space for facilitation. So yeah, that's where I would say I sit.
So if we say that you're going to be the originator for many ideas, what do you do when you're in the situation where you have one or a number of executives that have that unfortunate weakness that if it's not invented here, i.e. with them, then they're probably going to be against it? And the typical answer is, well, you get them to believe that it was their idea. That's the typical answer, and that's not always possible, because these are not stupid people. How do you handle that situation?
So I used to think that it was about making people believe it was their ideas. And that was an eye-opening experience, because at the end of the day, when you're dealing with really smart people, they know when you're trying to manipulate them.
Yeah.
So what I say now is it's all about authenticity. So the thing that I try to do is separate the person from the idea. And a lot of times what I realize with executives is, more often than not, executives just want to feel heard, seen, and loved like everybody else. But because they're sort of like on the top, they think that they have to have this infallible, like always being right, always adding value perspective. And I would say that really describes like a weak leader more than a strong leader. Some of the strongest leaders I've ever been will be in a meeting for 2 hours and they'll ask 2 questions and they'll say nothing. They want to hear from their team first. They want to empower their team first. Typically, like the loudest first person to talk, and they always say, like in a negotiation, the first person to talk loses. you know? So I think that like getting better at listening, but in terms of how I diffuse those time bombs with executives, in my opinion, it's understanding their idea, the origin of their idea, and what got them to that. So like really, I like to ask a lot of questions about different ideas. Like, and I think what ends up happening is people will realize very quickly when you go down that line of questioning. So, you know, there's a lot of trite ways to do this. There's the 5 whys, which everyone talks about, blah, blah, blah. But like getting really specific, it's going down a pathway to understand a person's idea. When they're having to explain it, a lot of times what they're realizing is that's where it falls apart. Maybe they saw something somewhere. Maybe it's a really good idea, but it doesn't quite line up to the realities of what's happening in their business. You know, a lot of times, again, high level ideas typically are they're missing information because they're not on the front lines, right? Like, and they're not spending time with the customer. They're not spending time in the factory, you know, with the people making the product, if you will. So I think a lot of times it's not about making it their ideas. It's about really understanding what's important to them and then showing them through dialogue, through discussion, through like whiteboarding or, you know, digital tools, that the idea that they're suggesting doesn't align to the strategy that they're trying to make happen, or that we're trying to make happen, or that we have agreed on. So I think it's very much agreement based. Like, can we agree that? And then sometimes it's just about prototyping it, right? Which happens a lot, where it's like, you know what, like we've got 5 really good ideas and like we're kind of at a stalemate and they're like so close in the scores that they all have. Let's like really agree that we're going to prototype 2 or 3 of these right now. And like, what's the minimum viable or minimum valuable experiment that we can run, not product, but experiment we can run to see which one actually deserves, you know, a V2 and deserves more energy. And I think that a lot of times executives get ignored, as crazy as that might sound. They have all the power, but in some cases, the people that are doing the work every day, you know, it's kind of like back in the day, you used to say, like, if the king is in charge, then why do the swordsmen hold all the power? Why do the knights have all the power? Well, it's because they're the ones on the front lines that are actually fighting the war. So I think in some cases, it's one thing to be a button pusher. It's a whole different thing when you're in the throes of it. And that's where I think that great leaders are able to give commanders intent, and not to get all militaristic on you, but like, I think great leaders can give commanders intent. And what I found is that when a leader brings me or my team in, they're looking for a solution. And I think the mediocre leaders just want their ideas to be heard. I think the great leaders want the best ideas to win. And I think that ultimately requires just keep going deeper and feeling like, what are we trying to do? How are we going to measure it? What are we trying to do? How are we going to measure it? How does that serve or not serve this customer? Or how does that serve or not serve our team? Or what's the second order consequences or effects that are going to happen if we do that thing? Like, let's really like play this out. So it's not just some pie in the sky idea that somebody like kicks up in, you know, at 12 o'clock on a Friday. That's what's worked for me. Again, I always be authentic, always be honest. Don't be afraid to challenge groups. You know, again, like I've been thrown out of rooms before. It hasn't happened in a really long time. But when someone's like, hey, if I'm being paid and my team's being paid to solve a problem creatively, and a person just doesn't want to listen, maybe we're not the right fit. You know, like relationships are about chemistry. Like there's been times where it's like, look, clearly you don't want us to solve the problem for you. You just want someone to listen to you. And we've listened to you for 6 hours. But if you're paying us to solve this problem, trust us that we're going to solve the problem. You know, you don't call a doctor and tell them what's wrong with you.
No,
right?
That's right. Yes.
You know, and if,
although, yeah, it happens. It happens in business a lot. Yeah. I've just written down, actually, I think it's going to be the quote for this podcast, which is, great leaders want the best ideas to be heard. I love that.
Yeah. Well, not just heard, but like actioned, right? Like, you know, every leader, I remember like 5 years ago, everyone was saying like bias for action, bias for action, bias for action. We want our teams to have bias for action. And then you would just watch like leaders that just have complete lack of ability to make decisions. And it's like, well, you're saying that everyone should have a bias for action, and then you're not making decisions. So you're modeling the completely opposite behavior you want your organization to have. So it's really difficult to unpack that one. Like,
yeah, you could take the counter view to that, and I think I remember Sir Harvey Jones here in the UK saying that his job, when he's been in his most senior roles, has been deciding what not to do, and that's been the most important thing. So bias to action is completely the opposite to that, deciding that we're not going to spend time, money, resources, and effort in pursuing that idea. Actually, we're going to focus on this.
Well, I love that. And what I would always say is great strategy is about sacrifice. It's more about the things you're not going to do than the things that you are going to do. Because no matter what you are, who you are, you always have a limitation of time, resources, competitive effects, whatever the things are. So great strategy is about like simplicity and clarity in what you're going to do. And, you know, what I always tell people is like, what makes a museum is not what's in the museum. It's what's not in the museum, right? Because if you just start adding a bunch of things into it, it's not a museum anymore. At that point, it's just like a bunch of shit in a room, you know? So I think it's that idea of like hyper curation and just ability to cut through the noise that I think separates like the greats from the goods. And I've had the pleasure of just working with some really great leaders and I've learned a ton from. I definitely wouldn't say I'm one of the greats, but I would say I've worked with many of the greats. And that's really helped me to realize like just the stomach you have to be able to plow through when at the end of the day, you're going to make a lot of people unhappy to be able to deliver on that. So yeah, no, I love that Sir Harvey Jones quote that you mentioned.
Final question, because we're running out of time. What's going to be the most effective Pete Sena and the most successful Pete Sena in your terms? The Pete Sena of today or the one 10 years in the future, and why?
I think if I said anything other than the one in the future, I think that I would be delusional, right? Because I think that.
Well, it helps to understand your mindset, because you could be somebody saying, actually, I'm going to be looking to be winding down over the next 10 years. So you could be answering in that way, but understanding why you believe you're going to be that much more effective is probably the most interesting, you know, kernel of that question.
Yeah. Fair. Great point. So I'm in the knowledge business, right? So if I was a basketball player, I would say that right now is the best me I'm going to be, right? I'm 40 now. So in 10 years, I'm definitely not going to be able to play basketball the same. No. But assuming all goes well, assuming I continue to take care of myself and am not sort of hit with some crazy, scary health thing at 50, I will have a lot more life experience. I will have seen a lot more things go well and not go well. I'll have a lot more data and a lot more wisdom and experience that I can lean into, a lot more patterns I've seen made or broken. So my thought is the more I can continue to grow as a knowledge worker, the more I can continue to grow as a leader and expose myself to smarter people than me, I believe that I will be that much more stronger in the work that I do as a knowledge worker in 10 years from today. I'm also like a lifelong learner. So I'm constantly absorbing new knowledge, applying that knowledge. And I think applied knowledge is what becomes wisdom, and wisdom is what ultimately leads to, better decision-making, better outcomes. That's just my belief system. So that I would say 10 years from now, I'll be a lot stronger. I think 10 years from now, I'll be a lot better with boundary setting. I think, one of the things that I've started to learn recently is time is finite. It's a currency we all share, no matter if, how much money we make, whatever it is, we all share the currency of time. And at some point we'll all run out of time, both in the meta way and the literal way. But I think that for me has me feeling bullish on the future. And it gives me something to chase, right? In terms of like continuously growing, continuously getting clear with my boundaries, with my value systems, with where I want to spend my time. And in 10 years from now, I might not want to get on a plane and fly to Austin like I just did yesterday, right? Or in 10 years from now, I might want to drop everything I'm doing right now to go get on that plane. And I think that just having clarity of thought and having space to be able to do that is something I'm really looking forward to continuing to cultivate. I look at myself 10 years ago versus 10 years today. I feel like fundamentally, like I feel like 10 years ago, I was a train wreck. I was, maybe successful by people's definition of success, which is, you know, making money, working with big clients, doing cool things. But like, I'm a shitload happier today than I was 10 years ago. You know, I've got a lot more that I get out of bed in the morning for, which is not just, you know, money, nice cars, you know, nice material things. Like, I'm grown up, you know, I've got amazing family now. I've got great friends. Like, I've got community and purpose. Like, you know, you can't put a price on that shit, like, because you can't, in my opinion. So I think that is all through learned experiences, right? So if you said to me 10 years ago with, you know, Pete, where are you gonna be in 10 years? Like, I couldn't predict 10 years ago where I would be today. But I feel like if I have the same question now, 10 years from now, you know, assuming AI doesn't, you know, take over the world and replace us as a species, I think it's gonna be great 10 years.
Excellent. Well, thank you for spending time with me today on this podcast. It's been an interesting one, I think. I hope that it's been an interesting one. So
I had
if somebody
fun,
wants
so hopefully the audience gets some value.
well, that's the
from
main
that.
thing. I think you forget about the audience and we just have a conversation that we enjoy, and then hopefully people listening in will enjoy it as well. So if somebody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way of reaching them?
Yeah. So what I would say is if you want to sort of get a flavor for what's going on in my brain, I have a free newsletter that I put out every 2 weeks. It's on petesena.com, which is just my first name, last name.com. There's a blue button that says subscribe. That's a good way to sort of tune into my brain. I see every email. So if you subscribe to my newsletter and you hit reply, say hi, introduce yourself. I will reply. It's not a robot. It's me. I try to respond to every single thing that comes in on that. My assistant's pretty good at like filtering out the spam. And if it's a real person, I will respond to it at some point. And that's one way to reach me. I'd say I'm pretty available on most of the social channels. So Twitter X, LinkedIn, starting to do more on Instagram now, even though it's a slog. the less time I can give to Mark Zuckerberg's universe, the better. But yeah, you can find me on all the places where Pete Sena lives on the internet.
Well, under the theme of digital surgeon, thank you for allowing me to probe and dissect your thinking. And I'll keep with that quote. Great leaders want the best ideas to be heard. And maybe we have that as the title for this podcast.
I love it.
But thank you very much for your time today. I've really enjoyed it.
Likewise.
Thank you very much.